So I'll just actually start by sharing why I actually started in the Theravada tradition. So I practice Tibetan Buddhism these days, but when I first was introduced to Buddhism, I was kind of coming off of like a Christian background, and I was very like reluctant to get involved with a religion. So for me, being introduced to Tibetan Buddhism, there's like all these Buddhas, and there's, an emphasis on like having devotion and faith toward your teacher and the teachings and stuff like that. And I was just kind of not ready to go there, honestly. And the Theravada form of Buddhism that I was introduced to is the Thai forest tradition. So really my first meditation teacher was the wonderful, wonderful monk Ajahn Ken. He's a Thai monk. He lives at Wat Budawas in northwest Houston. And, what I appreciated about the Theravada tradition was it's very simple. It's very like stripped down compared with Tibetan Buddhism. If we do kind of a deeper dive, or when we do a deeper dive into the Vajrayana tradition, I'll share some more about Tibetan Buddhism with you, but it can get very complex. The beginning of my Buddhist journey was really more about the Theravada tradition. And if you think about it, the Theravada tradition is, well, for those who don't know, the Theravada tradition is the form of Buddhism that has survived to the modern day that is most related to the earliest teachings of Buddhism. So they use the Pali Canon, which is the first language that the Buddhist teachings were written down in, and they were written down several centuries after the time of the Buddha. So nobody was like sitting around in the Buddha's time like writing down what he said. Back then, the idea was that if something was really sacred, you didn't write it down, you memorized it. So for several centuries, people transmitted the Buddhist teachings orally. People would memorize them and pass them on. One monk in a monastery might be responsible for memorizing one sutra or Buddhist scripture text. So it was transmitted orally for quite a while, but then when it was written down, it was written originally in the Pali language, which is not the language that the Buddha would have spoken, but it is a sacred language of ancient India. And in the Theravadan traditions nowadays, Pali is still what they use for chanting, to read suttas or scriptures. And I'll tell you a little bit about the time that I spent in a Thai monastery and a couple of retreat centers in southern Thailand. And we would get up every morning, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and chant sutras in Pali. It was wonderful. So I'll tell you a bit about that later after I've talked a little bit more about, the beliefs and the practices of Theravada Buddhism. And I just also want to say, to begin with, when I talk about Theravada Buddhism, my tradition, as I said, was with the Thai, or my experience was with the Thai forest tradition. So if I had been in Burma or Sri Lanka or like other major centers for Theravada Buddhism, I could have had a very different experience with it. It's not like the Theravada tradition is just one thing. At the end of this session, I want to talk a little bit about Theravada, leaving Southeast Asia, coming to the West, spreading globally, and really inspiring the whole mindfulness movement. So even if you don't know anything about Theravada, you probably, if you've ever done mindfulness meditation, you've probably used some basic principles of the Theravada tradition. You just might not know it. So the first thing I want to share is kind of going back to the history that we talked about in the last session. If you'll recall, I talked about, at least according to like Buddhist history and Buddhist legend, Emperor Ashoka in, I guess, about the 2nd century BCE, sending missionaries, Buddhist missionaries, down to southern India, down to what's now Sri Lanka. And so Sri Lanka has had Theravada style Buddhism, like the oldest school of Buddhism, for a long time. And from Sri Lanka, the tradition of Theravada spread initially to Burma. I believe that was in around the 5th century of the Common Era. And from Burma, in about the 11th or 12th century, it spread to Thailand. And Sri Lanka and Burma, back in those early centuries of the Common Era, they had a tight relationship because they shared this bond of Theravada Buddhism. And, nowadays it's sort of like Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand are like the sort of the centers of the Theravadan world. And so the tradition is very powerful there. And a lot of the teachers who have spread the Theravada tradition to the West are trained in these countries. But if you look at I shared a link to this document that I created that has a little graphic. It has some notes from today's talk. So if you want to grab that, the link is in the chat. But if you look at that, the top of that page is a little image from buddhanet.net that shows the spread of Theravada Buddhism from Sri Lanka into Burma, into Thailand. And now, obviously, you'd have to expand that map to include the entire world because there are Theravada centers everywhere, Africa, North and South America, Asia, obviously, Europe. So Theravada, when we talk about it, it has a long history. I think sometimes people conflate Theravadan Buddhism and early Buddhism. And I just want to be clear here that modern Theravada has adapted to the cultures that it's in. And especially now globally, we have secular Buddhism and secular mindfulness, and a lot of that is really based on the Theravadan tradition. So it's not like we're talking about one thing, but we can still talk about some basic principles that all forms of Theravada Buddhism share. And honestly, all forms of Buddhism would agree with this. So I'm not just talking about things that Theravadins believe. The Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions that we're going to talk about over the next 2 weeks, they have added on extra texts in Sanskrit and Chinese and Tibetan, but they haven't really thrown out this earliest layer. What makes up this trunk? I like to think of the Buddhist traditions as like a tree. They're all connected to each other. They all enrich and strengthen each other, but they're not the same thing. One of the most core teachings in really all of Buddhism is the idea of samsara and nirvana. And the reason I'm even talking about this is because if you're at all familiar with any form of traditional Buddhism, you've heard these terms. But a lot of, secular Buddhism or mindfulness instruction, especially in the West, it doesn't necessarily take these two ideas seriously. But I think to understand traditional forms of Buddhism, you have to understand and appreciate samsara and nirvana. And the idea of samsara is that it is the cycle of birth, never quite getting our life together, and then dying, and then being born again and trying the whole cycle over again. The idea is we literally die and are reborn again and again and again. And the thing that's really sad about that process or that cycle is that we are just playing the wrong game. We think we're finally going to get everything lined up in our lives. We're going to be happy and healthy, and we're going to have plenty of money. We think it's possible to get all that stuff finally locked in, but it's not, according to Buddhism. And I'll talk about why in just a second with the 3 characteristics of phenomena. So from a Buddhist perspective, we're all here spending all this energy trying to get all the external circumstances right. And at the end of the day, we're never going to make that work. And I think this is something really important to distinguish Buddhism from mindfulness or other forms of spiritual practice. This is not a positive affirmations thing where if you believe it enough, everything good is going to come to you in your life and nothing bad will happen to you. Nope. Buddhism, and particularly Theravadan Buddhism, says as long as we have not woken up to the true nature of reality, we're always going to be subject to suffering. Even if life is good now, we don't know that it's going to be good next year. I mean, life in January of 2020 did not predict what life was going to look like in March of 2020, for instance. But the really good news of the Buddhist tradition is that, okay, we're playing the wrong game. We're trying to get the externals right. We're trying to get, you can even think of trying to have good health and wealth and all this stuff as externals because we don't control our bodies. I mean, if we get sick tomorrow, we can't just decide not to be sick anymore. So we're trying to get all these external things right that we don't really control. But instead, if we would focus on recognizing what reality really is, we could wake up, we could be done with all suffering, we would finally start like playing the right game, and there is an exit to samsara. This is called in Pali Nibbana. The Sanskrit is Nirvana, not just a band name anymore. So Nibbana is when you finally see directly for yourself, experientially, into the nature of reality, and you wake up out of sort of the dream state that we usually live in. The thing is, we don't realize we're living in a dream state. Like, if we all knew we were living in a dream, we'd be trying to wake up, but we're not, usually. That brings me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is the 3 characteristics of phenomena. So these are the things that if we realize them, we would wake up. And that's what Buddhist meditation is all about, is waking up. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But basically, the 3 characteristics of phenomena are, first of all, impermanence. Second of all, lack of an inherently existent self. And third, what you might call unsatisfactoriness, or the Pali word is dukkha. So first of all, we think of ourselves as kind of like stable, ongoing beings. You know, in March of 2020, I had some teachings on the West Coast of the US planned, and that did not happen. So every time we make plans, even if it's just dinner plans for tomorrow night, we just assume that the me who makes the plans is going to be the me who shows up to do the thing that we planned. And the Buddhist tradition basically says, no, you're not. Like, we're changing moment to moment. Like, every time you breathe in, you're adding new chemicals to your body. Every time you breathe out, you're releasing old chemicals. So even at a physical level, we cannot say I am the same person from like 1 second to the next. We're constantly experiencing low levels of change, and every now and then we experience humongous changes, like COVID, or like getting in an accident of some kind, or losing somebody, or finding your, life partner. So this idea of impermanence is foundational to all schools of Buddhism, and the idea is that we assume we're not going to change very much, but we do. And we don't know when we're going to change, and some of those change factors are out of our control. Like I said, having an accident, losing a loved one, winning the lottery. There's just a lot of stuff that can happen to us that changes our world very, very quickly. But we don't tend to realize it. So that's number 1, impermanence. Number 2, lack of an inherently existent self. This, I think, is one of the things that just trips people up about Buddhism in general. And, it's the Theravada tradition. This is something everybody agrees with, so I don't want to take all of Theravada's time talking about basic core shared beliefs, but this is really important for the Theravada tradition. So according to the Theravada understanding of this doctrine of lack of an inherently existent self, what we really have is a body and a mind. And, they talk about the 5 aggregates. So there's the body and there's the 4 aggregates of mind. So like consciousness and volition, different aspects of our mental experience. And all those things together, we stick one label on top of it and we say, oh, that's me. And the idea behind this doctrine it's called anatta, or in Sanskrit, it's anatman. I'll put this in the chat too. Anatta, anatman. So the idea is we think there is a self in just a collection of experiences. We experience our body, we experience our mind, and on top of that, we stick this label, me. And the problem with that, again, is that the body's gonna die, or it's gonna change. It's gonna, be influenced by circumstances. Our mind, holy cow, it changes all the time. It's changing every single moment of the day. So if I think I am, for instance, my memories, and then I get hit on the head and I lose my memories for a couple of days. Did I just disappear? Or, you know, this is part of what makes like dementia so painful for the person experiencing it and the people around them. You start losing your memories. And it really can feel sometimes as though that person is going when they no longer recognize, you know, family members or people who are important to them. So the idea that a stable, ongoing sense of self can really be built on top of just these parts that make us up, these mental factors, this physical factor, you know, from a Theravada perspective, that's where we go wrong. And again, I want to connect this in a moment to meditation in the Theravada tradition, because this is really what we're trying to realize. You know, when we talk about mindfulness, in the Buddhist tradition, we're being aware of something very specific. We're trying to tune into the true nature of reality. So the last thing is dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, and this one really follows from the first two. If we think we're permanent but we're not, if we think there's an actual self that we can somehow satisfy with like the right conditions but there's not, then when we try for those things, it's inevitable that we're gonna fail. And then it feels like I am screwing up, I am a loser, you know, why can I not, whatever, get my life together? And so it brings us unhappiness, because it's like we have a map of the world, but maybe like the map is outdated or it's not very good. So we're trying to get here and we think there's a road that's going to take us here, but when we get on that road, we find that we're somewhere else and we don't quite know how to get back to where we were trying to go. And that right there, the mismatch between how we think of reality and how it really is, that is what creates dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. So it's not that like life is suffering, it's inevitable that we're all going to suffer, so like let's just get on with suffering or something like that. I think that's how people misunderstand Buddhism sometimes. But what this aspect of reality, characteristic of phenomena, if you will, is talking about is that we misunderstand things. And if we don't understand the way the world is, we can't navigate it properly. So, having said that, the next thing here is meditation. And probably, you know, when anyone hears Buddhism, they automatically think like, well, meditation is the main thing that people do. And that's true for some people, but historically it's been a pretty small minority of people who identify as Buddhist who actually do meditation. So I want to throw that out there. Many of the beliefs and practices that Buddhists will do are making merit for your next lifetime, or making offerings for a good harvest, you know, for your crops, or taking your children to the temple to get them blessed. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into being Buddhist that's kind of like if you're a Christian and you know, go to church on Easter, or you know, pray to God for safety or health, or, you know, for your children's well-being. Like there's all that stuff too. So if you're thinking like, oh, all Buddhists are like kind of enlightened and they all meditate and blah, blah, blah. Like, no, Buddhists are pretty much like everybody else. But they do have this amazing set of guidelines. You know, we have this amazing set of guidelines in the Dharma to try and keep us like on track. And there is also, you know, the path leads in the direction of Nibbana or Nirvana. So a lot of people don't necessarily think they're going to make it in this lifetime, but that's where they want to go eventually. And it's a very inspiring goal. Okay, so let's talk about, there's sort of like two major forms of meditation. And this is true for all Buddhist traditions, but it's something you definitely hear talked about in the Theravada. So there's kind of like two aspects to meditation. That is samatha and vipassana. And samatha or shamatha, so samatha is the ability to like focus the mind on an object. So if you're doing a breath meditation and you're just resting your breath or your mind on the breath, you're coming back to the breath again and again, that is samatha. You're building your mind's ability to focus, because if your mind can't focus, you really can't do anything else with it either. Like no other form of meditation is gonna make a deep, lasting impact if you can't bring your full attention to something. And the other aspect of meditation is what's called vipassana. And this word vipassana, probably people are more familiar with it now because vipassana retreats have become a big thing. But the word vipassana actually means, or it can be translated as like special insight. So special insight means our mind is concentrated. We're able to really focus, for instance, on the breath. We'll just use this as an example because probably every one of y'all has done this type of meditation. So if you're using the breath as your object of meditation, you're focused on it. And to add a vipassana element, for instance, you might start to wonder, well, is the breath impermanent? Can I find anything in this cycle of breath that's not changing? And if you really focus on your breath and you're looking for even a single moment of that cycle of breathing when there's nothing happening, you really can't find it. Even the pauses between the out-breath and the in-breath and the out-breath, like your body is alive. You're feeling things. You're going from like, I just breathe out and that's comfortable, to I think I want to breathe in now, to oh my God, I really need to breathe in right now. So like things are constantly changing. The same thing with anatta. You know, if you use that focused mind in a meditation session to really wonder, where is this me that I feel like I have? There's a meditation where you go through all the different parts of your body. Is me like my right ear? Is it my left ear? Is it my nose? Is it the right hemisphere of my brain? Is it my amygdala? So you're going through every part of your body and like taking your body apart. So what seems like one simple thing, like it's just my body, you're realizing the incredible complexity, the way that all these different organs, work together. And honestly, the way that everything is just put up, your body is made up of parts. So when you do that kind of meditation, you're beginning to understand the simple sense of body or self or me that I have is inaccurate. And then the same thing with dukkha, with unsatisfactoriness. I created a meditation on my podcast. My podcast is called Buddhist Wisdom, Modern Life. I created a meditation that I call the dukkhometer. So like you're measuring the dukkha in your experience. And that too is a form of vipassana, of insight, of like noticing the nature of reality. So as you're meditating, you're just noticing, when I have like a really strong grasping, like I'm fantasizing about this like delicious thing I'm going to eat when I finish this session, is it pleasant or unpleasant or neutral? Just every experience you have, is it pleasant, is it unpleasant, or is it neutral? You're noticing the degree of dukkha or the absence of dukkha. Maybe you just have like a moment where you're settled and everything is calm and peaceful and it just feels wonderful. Like there's almost a complete absence of dukkha in that moment. So you're just noticing, because usually we assume that pleasure is going to bring us satisfaction. And often, the whole process of like longing for something, getting something, enjoying it, and then it's gone and you're looking for the next fix, it actually doesn't bring us the kind of satisfaction we're looking for. So the whole process of vipassana, part of it is about really learning to recognize these three characteristics of phenomena, which begins to undo the assumptions that we have about the world. We begin to bump up against our assumptions, and then we can start teasing them apart. Even other forms of like spiritual traditions have their versions of vipassana. Christian mystics and the Kabbalah and stuff like that. Like every tradition comes up with their own way of teasing apart reality. And also every Buddhist tradition has their version of vipassana. Sometimes they do it differently, but they're doing what they think of at least as the same basic thing. So I want to just touch on one other really important aspect of the Theravadan tradition before I move on to the sort of more modern mindfulness tradition. There's an excited small child hanging out outside my door here. She's my niece. She's adorable. But anyway, so if you hear some shouting, that's what's going on. So the last thing I want to talk about is monasticism, is ethics. And in Buddhism in general, again, this is all different varieties of Buddhism, have basically like three components to them. There's wisdom, there's meditation, and there's ethics. So if you've heard discussions of the Noble Eightfold Path, it kind of breaks down into those three things. And when we talk about the three characteristics of phenomena and like understanding the world as it is, that's wisdom. When we talk about, you know, the relationship between samatha and vipassana, between calm abiding and special insight, that's meditation. And then ethics is the other part of this that's really important. And I think in my experience, this is where the Theravada tradition, one of the things that for me is has had the most impact of my time spent with the Theravada tradition is really this sense of ethics and renunciation. So I want to tell you just a little story from my own life before I talk about this aspect of the Buddhist path. But basically, when I graduated from college at Rice, in like 1999, I had started meditating with like this Thai monk, this Thai temple. I'd also started doing some Tibetan style meditation by then, but I really wanted to go deeper into this like Thai forest tradition of meditation and practice. So I went to Thailand for about 5 months, and I started off meditating and practicing at this amazing place called Wat Pa Nanachat. We just called it Wat Pa. And that is like a monastery for foreigners built by Ajahn Chah, one of the great, great masters of, I guess, a couple of generations ago now in the Thai forest tradition. So what we would do there, you know, I was a layperson. I was not ordained. There were monks who lived there. And I probably would have ended up ordaining if I was a guy, but, you know, they were like, you should probably not ordain here. Why don't you go to England? And I was like, it rains a lot there. That's not going to happen. So anyway, I was really hardcore. I was really interested, and I ended up staying for about 6 weeks at Wat Pa until the monks left for a rainy season retreat. And, you know, the lifestyle there was you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 the first meditation session starts. So everybody's walking through the dark. They have these little like solar powered lamps along the path. Everybody goes to this, you know, outdoor meditation space, this like Buddha statue in the front, all these orange robed monks. It's just beautiful. It made me feel like, am I in the time of the Buddha or is this 1999? So you do your meditation, and then around dawn, the monks go out on their alms round. And the rule is they have to be barefoot. And Thai people they love supporting their monastics. So monks, sometimes there were some resident nuns, and some of us lay people would get to like follow behind. Well, you know, we lay women would get to follow behind the nun and like hold her alms bowl. But basically, every morning at dawn, the monks would go on a round through the village, and they're not allowed to ask for food. So they just walk through the streets, and if people come out and put food into their bowls, then they have food for the day. Realistically, people love giving to the monks, so they all come out with their food to put into the monks' bowls, and like lay people will come, you know, for the one meal of the day that happens after the monks get back from their alms round. And, you know, people will sort of prepare the food that they've gotten and lay it out. And then the monks eat first, and then the lay people eat everything that's left over. So it's a great way for people to show their support to the monastics. It's also a way for folks to maybe supplement their diet if they're not getting a lot of food at home. So anyway, by coming and sort of eating, you know, what's left after the monks eat. So it's very simple, one meal a day. There's usually kind of a, you know, like a snack break, like the monks would drink Ovaltine in the afternoon, but there's no dinner. They have really no personal possessions. And this is not true of all monasteries and all monks, but this is the way it was at Wat Pa, and I think it's similar for places where people are really trying to make some progress toward Nibbana. So one meal a day, you know, afternoons, after lunch, there would be chores to do. There'd be, you know, you could do additional meditation sessions, either in the group area or in your own little hut. And then in the evening, there's another meditation session, and then you turn in about 9 o'clock. So it's a very simple lifestyle, and there's a lot of emphasis on renunciation. So, not trying to accumulate goods. Not even for us lay people, obviously, but like especially for the monks, there's an old rule that monks are not even supposed to handle money. So it's a real it's a culture of stripping down, letting go, not doing anything to kind of bolster and hold together that ego. I say ego, that sense of self. So there's that. The other part of the Thai tradition that I really appreciated when it came to ethics is like, for the monks, for instance, they have hundreds of rules they're supposed to follow. So there are rules about, how to stand up and how to drink and how to eat. And it's basically like enforcing a sense of mindfulness all the time, just really noticing what you're doing. There aren't the same kind of rules for lay people, but it's a very supportive system for just not doing stuff that is going to create bad karma, and for instead putting your energy into things that really matter. So that sense of ethics, that sense of really paying attention to what you're doing, and also that sense of letting go of everything that is going to keep you stuck to the goal of trying to make this life exactly what you want it to be. So it's a difficult discipline for me. I found it difficult in the sense that there's really nothing to hold on to. It's all about doing your practice, letting go of everything that you want to make into a sense of self. And I found that really beautiful. And so the last thing I want to say about this idea of, renunciation in the Thai tradition is it really is about, seeing into the nature of reality, letting go, not giving yourself excuses and reasons to stay stuck onto things. That brings me to Theravada and the mindfulness movement. I want to actually share a little guide that I made for this talk. You probably have already noticed, we're in talking about the Theravada beliefs, we're talking about the 3 characteristics of phenomena. We're talking about Samsara and Nirvana. We're talking about, monasticism and giving up, a lot of life's comforts, giving up the idea of, I'm going to arrive someday. And often what people have kind of pulled from the Theravada tradition is sometimes just samatha. So for instance, learning to rest your mind on your breath is super important, but it's also just the beginning of Buddhist meditation. If you don't have that vipassana element where you're investigating your assumptions about permanence, or like just that you're an ongoing being, the sense of self that we have, the sense that sooner or later I'm going to arrive and, everything's going to be good and happy and I'm going to be satisfied in an ongoing way. If you're never exploring and kind of beginning to tease apart those assumptions about the world, it might be super helpful for stress reduction, for learning to focus the mind. I mean, folks with ADHD or, tendencies in that direction, it could be super helpful to learn that samatha part of it. But without the vipassana part, from a Buddhist perspective, it doesn't really lead to freedom. So basically, the story I want to tell you about this is that in, the 60s and 70s, I'm just going to take a group of people who started the Insight Meditation Society, IMS, in, I think, Barre, Massachusetts. I'm going to take them as an example. There were other people also doing this kind of work, but I think these are like the best known and they've had a huge impact. So Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, and Jacqueline Mandel, Mandel Schwartz, who's part of my Tibetan Sangha now, so I actually kind of know her. It's really cool to have a personal connection to this history. So they were all over in South and Southeast Asia. Sharon Salzberg tells the story of like going to India as part of her, as like a study abroad, experience during college. So they're all over there with different teachers. And, each of these people I'm talking about found their way to Theravada. And I believe they all met up maybe in a Vipassana retreat. There's kind of a Dharma circuit, you know, like different retreats and different monasteries where people tend to go and stay. And it sounds like even back in the day that was the case. So, you know, these particular folks, they were over there. They spent a long time, you know, years really practicing. And I think both of the men were monks, at least for a while. I'm not super sure about that. But basically, they have really deep roots in the Theravada system. And particularly, they all got connected with Burmese-style Theravada practice. And then they came back to the US, and basically, over the decades since, you know, the 1970s, they've developed a secular version of, you might say, some of those parts of like Vipassana, Samatha. They've developed a secular version of that. So you don't necessarily get, you know, Samsara and Nirvana. I think you get in certain ways, at least, you know, with their teachings, you get impermanence, you get lack of an inherently existent self. But so they were really, I think, trying to do the work of cultural translation, of taking these like amazing practices they learned in Asia and trying to present them in a way that was going to make sense to Westerners. So that's like one layer of it. The next layer up is you have people like Jon Kabat-Zinn, who founded mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, who learned from them and then applied those techniques toward stress reduction, or, you know, what we now know of as like secular mindfulness. So the secular mindfulness tradition is, the roots are almost entirely coming from the Theravada tradition. There's also some input from Zen, some input from the Tibetan tradition, but the roots are very deep in the Theravada tradition. And it makes sense to kind of source a secular tradition there because there's not the kind of like guru devotion that we're going to see in the Vajrayana tradition. There's not billions and bajillions of Buddhas like we're going to see in Mahayana. It's kind of a stripped down, you know, let's just get right to the point. Let's wake up and stop suffering, y'all. Like that is the heart of Theravada Buddhism. And so it makes sense to adapt that to become this amazing technique, mindfulness, that people have learned all over the world. Like there's so much mindfulness going on now that it's hard to even know what that word means anymore. But its roots are in the Theravada. So in a way, the Theravada system has really contributed to the spread of mindfulness. There are Theravada monasteries and training centers that you know, this is where people sometimes meet the Dharma. And this mindfulness, you know, especially in a more secular format, has just spread so broadly. So, you know, when we talk about Theravada Buddhism, obviously the countries where it was nurtured to reach its current form are in South and Southeast Asia, but really its spread is global now. Whew. All right. So that was a whirlwind tour of Theravada Buddhism. If you have any questions, please feel free to just post them. Also, I want to say this talk and this little series that I'm doing on different types of Buddhism, they were both inspired by just somebody asking for talks on this topic. So if you want to join my circle on Insight Timer, it's called Buddhist Wisdom Modern Life. The other thing I want to say too is if you're interested in, you know, getting my newsletter, hearing about just other stuff that I'm doing, you can go to the link on my Insight Timer profile page thingy. I'm just sharing that link here in the chat too. And if you sign up, you know, for my newsletter, if you sign up to even get the resources that I'm offering here, then I'll let you know when I'm doing stuff like this in the future, so you can join. I hope this is helpful for understanding a little bit more about Theravada and how it relates to like what Buddhism looks like globally nowadays. I'm going to be offering another talk next week and the week after. We're going to talk about the Mahayana traditions, so like Zen, Pure Land, Chan, that kind of thing. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk about Vajrayana, so like Tibetan Buddhism, Nepali, Bhutanese, Mongolian Buddhism. And we'll just kind of like have at least a big overview of these different forms of Buddhism so that it makes sense how these traditions kind of fit together.